Dr. Avi Loeb, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Now, Doctor, there was a paper recently released that gave yet another in a long line of perhaps problematic explanations for the mysterious object Oumuamua. And you have authored a paper in response to this, that this object, they say, was emitting hydrogen, and that might have created the push and acceleration that we saw with this object. You say no. Give us an overview of your new paper.
Well, first, it's fascinating that more than 5 years after the Oumuamua was discovered, the mainstream of the astronomy community still has difficulties explaining the anomalies of it. And the anomaly that was most attended to is the excess acceleration the object exhibited away from the sun. And it wasn't clear what is giving it that push, since we didn't see any cometary tail and there wasn't the rocket effect acting on it. And that's just one anomaly out of many. I should say that in the first year, there were a number of papers written about the data that was collected, and people were saying Oumuamua looks really weird in this respect, another respect. It doesn't look like a comet. At first, they thought it's a comet. Then they said, no, it's an asteroid. Then they said, no, it's a comet. No, it's an asteroid. It wasn't clear. It had a flat shape. It had an extreme elongated shape. It was also coming from a special frame of reference, and it didn't have a cometary tail, nevertheless exhibited this acceleration. So now, more than 5 years later, another model was suggested. Now, the strange thing is, as soon as I suggested that it may be artificial in origin, the mode of the conversation changed, and experts started writing papers pushing back against the idea that it's weird, saying, it's of natural origin, and in fact, it's actually generic, and there is nothing to worry about. And it's really strange because each of these experts came up with a different model, and they disagree with each other. And in the latest incarnation, I mean, at first people suggested maybe it's a dust bunny, maybe it's a hydrogen iceberg, maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg, and each of these had problems. So one of the co-authors of the new paper is Daryl Seligman, and he wrote a paper back in 2020 suggesting it's a hydrogen iceberg. And a few months later, we wrote a paper showing that it doesn't work. That was with my colleague, Tim Huang. We basically show that hydrogen evaporates too quickly in interstellar space by absorbing the heat from starlight. And so any chunk of frozen hydrogen that may be formed in a giant molecular cloud will not make it to the solar system. And in fact, in the abstract of the new paper that just came out a few days ago, the same author, Daryl Seligman, admits that the hydrogen iceberg idea is not working. But now, with another collaborator, he proposes a variant, which is hydrogen mixed with water ice. And that's with Jennifer Bergner, and they basically suggest you start with ice, water ice, as you find in the outer part of the solar system, the Oort cloud, and then over time, as a result of the ice being exposed to cosmic rays, very energetic particles, the water molecules break into hydrogen and oxygen. And they say, well, if we work out the numbers, if you start with 30% or about a third of the water molecules being broken, then the hydrogen can evaporate when the object comes close to the sun and give the object the necessary push to explain the observed acceleration. Now, first of all, we're talking about a third of all the molecules being broken, which is quite excessive, especially since the object had a size of order 100 meters. So you need these cosmic rays to penetrate tens of meters and destroy a third of the water molecules. But nevertheless, let's assume that. And then they calculate that it gives, there is enough evaporation. But in order to find that, you need to figure out the temperature on the surface of this iceberg, this hypothetical iceberg. And they calculate it by balancing the heat input from sunlight that is impinging on the surface with the radiation coming out of the surface. So balancing the energy in with the energy out, which is the usual thing you do for a planet, for example. That explains the temperature of the Earth and temperature of Mars and so forth. The only thing they forgot is that the main motivation for their model is that hydrogen is bound more strongly to a water molecule than it is to another hydrogen atom. And that's why you keep the hydrogen atoms and not allow them to leave the system during the interstellar journey. So that's the benefit relative to having just pure hydrogen. And so now it comes to haunt you, this benefit, because in order to release the hydrogen atom, to dislodge them from the lattice, you need to invest 10 times more energy than if it was pure hydrogen. So they forgot to take that into the energy balance. So in other words, it's just like getting a salary, paying the bills on electricity and the rent and so forth, and just forgetting that you have to feed your family. And if you don't take that into account, you're in good shape, of course. And that they wrote a Nature paper saying, well, there is enough energy, everything works perfectly, the surface temperature is high, 150 degrees or so, and that allows hydrogen to evaporate, and you end up with enough push, enough propulsion. We realized that, together with my colleague Thim Huang, that there is this missing term in the energy budget. Energy conservation is really fundamental. And it's too bad that Nature magazine did not consult me as a referee. I would have flagged it immediately. That's something you immediately notice. But instead, they selected referees that are observers, very eager to explain Oumuamua as a natural object. The editor was happy. The authors were happy. They went out through the publication process and then made a big fuss in the media about it. All major journals, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, everywhere, Scientific American, everyone celebrated the fact that here is a simple explanation that accounts for everything. And I saw the paper the same day that all of this came out. And within one day, we had a paper out saying, wait, you forgot to include the energy that needs to be invested in evaporating the hydrogen. As a result, you get a much lower temperature of the surface. We calculated it, and it's an order of magnitude lower. So we're talking about for the 20 degrees or so. And as a result, because the temperature is so lower, the speed by which hydrogen atoms are leaving the surface is lower by a factor of 3. So they give less push through the rocket effect by a factor of 3. Then you need to actually, instead of 1/3 of the iceberg being converted to hydrogen, you need to convert everything. You need to take all the water, convert it to hydrogen and oxygen. But if you convert everything to hydrogen on the surface, it resembles a hydrogen iceberg. So you didn't benefit anything. And in fact, you have the oxygen that you need to push against. So it's a worse scenario than just pure hydrogen. And moreover, at such a low temperature, it's not at all clear that the hydrogen will come out, because the temperature enables the hydrogen atoms to leave. So altogether, this scenario is not tenable at all. This model doesn't work. And of course, we shared the paper with the authors, with Nature magazine, and I'm sorry to say, with 14 other major newspapers and outlets. Some of them, I should say, very surprisingly, some science reporters came back to me and said, sorry, we just published the report about the Nature paper. We don't want to confuse our readers. What I said in response is, this is not politics here, where different people can have different opinions and both of them are viable. In science, if you claim 2 + 2 is 5, and actually 2 + 2 is 4, then the first answer is wrong. There is right and wrong in science. And if it's clear that they missed an important term in energy conservation, their paper is wrong. It's not an opinion that they expressed and we are disputing, and you can present both or just ignore ours. And so I said the oath that should be taken by science reporters is to adhere to scientific truth. They should have that integrity. They cannot just say, oh, we just posted this paper and we don't need to correct it because it will confuse our readers. Because the point is, right now they're confusing the readers. In fact, it's misinformation. And when we complain about politicians providing misinformation, let's say about COVID-19 or other matters that affect the public, how can science reporters agree to cover up what might be wrong about a report they just made yesterday? So that's my realization, which is very sober, of this unfortunate reality that we live in, where adhering to the truth, especially in science, is not a sacred principle. They could have easily just added a comment saying, Avi Loeb makes this correction based on a paper he wrote with Tim Huang, or saying, we will write a new report, which in fact, the Times in London wrote back to me and said that. So clearly the Brits have a lot of integrity.
Now, how often have you run across this phenomenon where the journals are promoting one paper over another as that in this situation? Now, of course, there's plenty of stuff the referees kick out, major journals, but when you're just posting a corrective paper like this, how often have you run into this problem?
Well, the way I see it is psychology. I mean, obviously, the journal doesn't want to admit that a mistake was made, so they want to minimize the damage to their reputation, especially Nature, which is a very prestigious journal. So they would have preferred that we would send the correction to them, and they would sort of hide it in a footnote with a small note from the author saying, yeah, we screwed up by a factor of 9 in the temperature, and that's it. But we wrote a whole paper about it, and I wrote an essay in Medium that already within less than a day got 5,000 views. So everyone, especially within the scientific community, knows about it. You cannot hide from scientific truth. If there was something wrong with our calculation, I would have heard from someone, especially the authors of the Nature paper. They would have explained it in a simple way. This silence is just inappropriate. It's much better to admit a mistake than to hide it in science, because in the long run, it will become clear. There is no way that this could somehow be hidden and forgotten, and people will just remember the original paper. So it's better to admit it if indeed it's there. And of course, the journal has an issue with reputation and so forth, but I'm talking about journalists that report about a result, and they might not be physicists. So they can say, okay, we cannot judge because we are not professionals, but they should feel an obligation to figure it out. They can speak with the authors of the paper. They can just quote me without taking responsibility. And of course, once our paper gets published, then they can report about it again, okay? But it's really fascinating to see that the editors, the referees, and the authors themselves did not notice this. And then everyone was jumping up and down and celebrating the result without noticing it. And you ask yourself why. And of course, one possibility is that because it fits a narrative. Okay, it fits the narrative that don't worry about it. It's just a rock of a type that is very typical. Now, the reason I suspected this must be wrong is because all the comets that have a very long period come from the Oort cloud. And the Oort cloud is embedded in the same cosmic ray environment as interstellar objects because it's outside the heliosphere where the solar wind is being blocked by the interstellar medium. So basically, the solar wind often protects comets from cosmic rays, but in the Oort cloud, they are not protected. And so when they come close to the sun and we see a long period comet, then it tells us that exposure to interstellar cosmic rays would not change the cometary behavior. Moreover, I should say, the second object that was reported from interstellar space was a comet, Borisov, by the amateur astronomer Gennady Borisov. So if they claim, as they do, that you take a chunk of frozen water, pass it through interstellar space, and it turns into this hydrogen water mixture that looks really weird because you never see the cometary tail, then Borisov should not have had a cometary tail. But we saw it, it was just like a familiar comet. So clearly, the two objects are really different. And, you know, what is a comet? A comet is an object that shows a coma around it from evaporated gases and dust.